Soft skills doesn't make you soft. It doesn't make the organization, the individual, the team weak.
Welcome to the TroopHR podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Bradley. Today in this episode, we're unpacking a topic that many professionals, especially high achievers, quietly grapple with: imposter syndrome. We explore this topic with leadership coach Melanie Manning and conflict resolution expert Kenya Salaudeen on surprising ways that imposter syndrome intersects with workplace conflict. From self-doubt that derails performance reviews to overwork driven by a need to prove worth, this episode shines a light on how internal narratives can ripple outward across teams and culture. We start this episode by asking Melanie and Kenya for a baseline definition of imposter syndrome that we can rely on as a guide throughout our conversation.
So imposter syndrome, as its basics, it's really high achieving individuals, primarily women, that have both academic and professional success, but they have a hard time recognizing and appreciating their accomplishments. They feel like they are fooling people into thinking that they're as equal or as accomplished as some of their peers and counterparts.
And then the way that is related or connects to workplace conflict, which, I think at first glance, it kind of sounds like a strange combination, because when you think of workplace conflict, you don't necessarily match it with imposter syndrome. But the way imposter syndrome shows up in the workplace can either initiate conflict or, make existing conflicts worse.
And that is what stood out to me, is this unique correlation that the two of you have found through your experiences and through your research of imposter syndrome and workplace conflict. What led you on this journey to focus on this topic to begin with?
I guess we'll back it up to when Kenya and I met at TroopHR retreat a couple of years ago. And then at this most recent one, we had started sharing our insights, experiences, and what passions we both had. And so we said, let's talk to Troop about possibly doing a podcast, and let's think about what we could bring forward as informed voices and with our experiences. And for me, I had 4 or 5 different venues this year where imposter syndrome came up repeatedly from the audience or participants. So I said, I think that's something to be explored. And then Kenya, I'll let you come in with your perspective on the other half of our topic.
Yeah. As I mentioned before, in terms of workplace conflict, it exists. It's already there. But I thought that, when Melanie and I were talking about some of the topics that we were either confronted with or excited by, we thought that this combination was one that maybe folks haven't heard before, but is real for a lot of women in the workforce.
So then let's start with the imposter syndrome side of the equation. When we identify, or when you're identifying these symptoms of imposter syndrome, what are you finding are some of the triggers behind that?
It can often be from starting a new job, going into a new role within an existing company, having a new manager, being assigned to a new stretch project to where your competencies that you knew before, you're not sure if they match up to your new team, your new manager, your new organizational expectations.
Yeah. Whatever it is that you're confronted with at work that kind of puts you in the spotlight would be a trigger for imposter syndrome.
And I am curious, while we're still in this part of the equation, when we all went remote and now there's this mandated return to office, Melanie, you mentioned that you've seen an uptick recently. Is there any correlation there, or what do you think is explaining this uptick that you've noticed?
What was interesting, I wouldn't use the term Taylor uptick, but it was interesting to me that it still existed in 2025, right? Because I started my career, not to date myself, early 2000s, and I heard it quite a bit in those financial settings that I worked in from female colleagues and counterparts. And in different workshops, there was always a workshop about imposter syndrome. And it was primarily, a female audience of professionals that attended. And so to hear it in 2025, I was on 2 panels this year with young professionals. So they are already starting to experience this. Then I was at another panel with very experienced professionals that still spoke about it. And then I was at a dinner party, primarily with women and a couple of men. And the men looked at us like we had 3 heads. Like, what are you all talking about? So I thought, it's 2025 and highly accomplished female professionals and students are still experiencing this. So I thought this is a topic that's still worth speaking about.
And I would add that us being, in a remote workforce now, we're boxes on a screen. And many organizations either require or, subliminally hint to their staff that they want them to have their cameras on. So whereas before when we were in person, you can kind of get away with hiding a little bit or not speaking up in a meeting. But being remote, you're a box on the screen and it's obvious if your box is off and it's obvious when your box is on and people are looking at you. So there's that spotlight.
When you're hearing these stories from individuals, how is this manifesting in the workplace?
This is really interesting because here's where we're able to see the correlation between imposter syndrome and workplace conflict. When women are experiencing imposter syndrome, a lot of times they are reluctant to speak up. They don't really want to or feel comfortable asserting their needs. If, there is some kind of challenge with or disconnect between themselves and one of their colleagues, confronting that conflict is something that they would be very averse to. Going back to the examples that Melanie gave earlier about the triggers, if I'm up for promotion, but all along I've been kind of, mousy and because I'm not sure of my skill set, I might trigger some of my colleagues to say, why does she deserve a promotion when she's not demonstrating that she can do this job? Or even during performance reviews, right? I want to avoid kind of showing who I am because I don't believe that I even belong in this role. And so when it's a performance review time, I may think that I did okay for the job that I'm in. I still have some doubts and my manager may be like, no, actually, actually you didn't. And so there is now this conflict or this disconnect between how the employee is experiencing their role and how the manager is experiencing them in the role. So there are, a lot of opportunities for imposter syndrome to kind of show up in the workplace and be a trigger for workplace conflict.
And I'll just add on to this. I was doing coaching with one of my client groups, and what came forward is that there was a big stretch opportunity, a big SWAT team that was pulled together. And one of my clients said that she really wanted to go and put her name forward to be part of that SWAT team internally, but she held back because she was fearful that she didn't have the skills and knowledge that the other people that had been selected to be part of the SWAT team. And then we talked through that, like what is the opportunity provide? What does she have as experience, knowledge, and skills? And so she convinced herself, she got back to her confidence and said, yeah, I'll put my name in. Hopefully I'll be selected and I'll be able to continue to grow and develop within my organization.
And there's a flip side to this too. So I mentioned maybe the employee, the woman who might show up in a way that's a little bit evasive and she falls back and she may not speak up in meetings. But the flip side to that is the person, because of imposter syndrome, who shows up and wants to be a perfectionist, or she overworks herself because she needs to prove to somebody that she belongs in this role. And so that need for protection a lot of times ends up transitioning into overwork or some type of burnout. And again, the trigger, or rather the underlying cause of that, is imposter syndrome, right?
Up until this point, we've talked about some of the signs and symptoms that we should be looking out for. How is this manifesting at work? Let's get into the practical. How do folks, when they identify that they have imposter syndrome, deal with it effectively in some practical ways? Melanie, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. We call it a syndrome, but it's not a clinical condition. It's a term that has been out there so long. So it's one of those things that if you're experiencing where you feel as though you're about to be exposed or you're not prepared or you're not as worthy as your colleagues, what I've coached is sit down and write down what you're experiencing. What are you feeling? Name it. You have to name it to claim it. That's, foundational for so many things. And write it out or talk with a trusted colleague or friend or, significant other. First, name what it is. What are these feelings that are coming up? And then in a separate body of work, I always say, write down what you know. What have you accomplished? One, go back and look at performance reviews. If you have had 360 surveys, look at your insights and your results from what other colleagues have said about what you bring into an organization, into a role, into a working group. Talk to friends and family that have known you for years and seen your growth. So I would say, first, name what you're experiencing, write it out, break it down, and then in a separate body of work, remind yourself what you have accomplished. And then what's transferable to this next opportunity or next role or new experience that you're looking to achieve.
And I would just add to that, from the workplace perspective, I think that organizations can try to establish some type of psychologically safe environment or culture that recognizes that there are folks in the workplace who experience imposter syndrome still, and provide them with the support that they need to help them to understand that they were chosen for this role or for this promotion because the supervisor, the manager, the organization does recognize, their expertise, the skills that they can bring to the role. So I think with the organization, just establishing a culture that supports that and recognizes it as a thing, that the organizations claim it also is really important.
And that's a great call out because obviously we're a community of HR leaders. Folks are going to know how do they implement this in the culture. Before we leave the individual on it, we've discussed this topic many times on this podcast. When we hear this saying, fake it till you make it, what are your all's thoughts on that saying and its usefulness in this environment?
Well, from the workplace conflict perspective, faking it till you make it reminds me of one of the destructive responses to conflict, which is acquiescing. And when we acquiesce, we're just kind of saying, it's whatever you want or however you want it. So in the case of imposter syndrome, it's kind of, I'm going to show up how I think you want me to show up. I'm not going to recognize who I am or what skills or expertise I really can bring to this role in this organization. I'm just going to show up and be the way I think the organization wants me to be. And then again, the other extreme to that is I'm just going to show everybody that I should be president, in the next week, although I just, was promoted to manager. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to show up super early. I'm going to work extra late, right? I'm going to do all those things because that's what I believe the organization wants to see and how I can prove, that I belong in this role.
Yes. And adding on to that with the fake it till you make it, I go back to my baseline of what are you faking? Write down what you feel like you need to fake. Is it a knowledge gap? Is it a skill gap? And then understand how you can start to develop the competencies in those things that you feel like you're faking, right? And then, larger scale is if you feel like that's what you need to do every day, you need to ask yourself, is this the right organization for you? Are you in the right role, right? That's another podcast that we can talk about. But if you are faking it till you make it in every aspect for multiple months or full year, then you really need to ask yourself the larger question. But I say, write down what you're faking and how can you bridge those gaps?
What I love is the naming it, because oftentimes our fears, when named on paper, don't seem as scary. And I really enjoy that. It's such a practical thing to just write it down and give it a thought, right? The other thing that you brought up, Melanie, just now, which was circulating in my head, is the environment the problem, right? And I don't think professionals think about that as much as they should. Is this the right opportunity for me here? Or could I go get the opportunity that I know I could get at another organization? And what do you think contributes to that mentality of I have to stay here?
So many things. One, in today's current state, it's more difficult to move and change jobs just because of the way the economy and the landscape looks. But secondly, a lot of people are adverse to change. They've worked really hard to get where they are, or they feel fortunate to have that opportunity. And now the thought of changing again may be too much for some people. So they'll stay in that system, in that environment, because it's easier than looking to make a change. Or something's changed in the environment. Maybe the leadership team has changed. When you joined, it was company A, it's now company C, and it no longer fits to your values, your motivators, where you feel comfortable and where you're contributing. So you have to then come back to, have I changed? Am I fearful of change, or has the organization changed?
Now let's get to the HR side of it. What do we do to ensure that this isn't happening in our culture, or how do we address this in our culture and our organization? What are some practical tips that you would have for the HR executives tuning in right now?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier about creating a psychologically safe organization or workplace culture. And I think the way that that can be done, one of the ways anyway, is to encourage open communication, right? A lot of times, folks who are experiencing imposter syndrome are really reluctant to speak up, as I mentioned earlier. That can, I think, lead to some conflicts if they don't believe that their perspective is valid. And if the organization recognizes that, that exists, that's real for some of their employees, creating a culture where people feel like they can speak up, they're not going to be demonize or it's not going to be punitive if they say whatever it is that they're thinking, what they're suggesting. I think that's one of the ways that organizations can help. And also, validate their perspectives, validate their confidence. We've all heard the story of women being in a meeting in the workplace and she offers up a suggestion or an idea and, there's no response to it. And then somebody else offers up a similar idea or suggestion, and then it gets all of the attention and all of the light. I think organizations or managers, leadership can recognize when that takes place in the workplace and intercept it or stop it, right? I think that's another way. And then also find ways to prevent imposter syndrome from flourishing. So recognizing what imposter syndrome is and how it shows up for the women in their workplace. Again, we talked about folks who shrink back. They may not want to speak up in meetings, or they may not want to turn their boxes on if they're remote. Just have a little more sensitivity to that. And then acknowledge the accomplishments of the women who are in the workplace, who are doing excellent jobs. Give them their shine, put respect on their name, right? And I think that those are some of the things that organizations can do. And then lastly, I would say also allow those employees or teach them how to own their successes, right? So we can, as HR folks or as managers, leaders, when it's performance review time, if organizations are doing those, we can love all the things that this employee brings, right? But they may not be able to see it. They may not be able to see their contributions, the accomplishments. So allow them to find ways to own their success and support that or encourage it. I think those are some ways organizations can sort of support employees who might be experiencing imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And to add on that, I think mentorship programs can go a long way as well. Either internal or external mentoring programs to have a safe space to talk those things through. If you are a small and lean HR team, this is a big body of work that you may feel like, oh, I don't have the bandwidth to do it. But you have an amazing community of troopers that will be out here to help you. It's like phone a friend, join a huddle, reach out. And there's so many of us that have gone through this and coached to it that would be, amazing to help support you through this internally with your own organizations.
It's a great call out. And the questions that I've seen put on the forum, no matter how esoteric, there's always a trooper that has experience with something or knows someone to get the support in there. So highly encourage that. I have two final questions here as we come in for a landing. Also, speaking with a lot of troopers, there is an apprehension to bring up soft skills in the workplace right now. Let's call a spade a spade. The culture's changed in the businesses in the past 2 years. How would you recommend our executives, when they go to pitch, we're going to focus on this, the connection to the business?
I think the first thing is to recognize that expressing emotions in the workplace is not taboo. And expressing emotions doesn't necessarily mean having a meltdown, having a breakdown, crying, or having a tantrum. I think that's what a lot of people think of when they think of soft skills or emotions or relating with somebody on a more personal level, what that looks like. Expressing emotions could be just verbalizing, being able to verbalize what it is that they're experiencing. Or, John, when you interrupted me in the meeting, that really didn't feel too good. I felt that you cut me off and please don't do that again. Right? So expressing the emotion is not a bad thing. Soft skills are not a bad thing in the workplace. Remember, the folks who are keeping that organization going are humans, right? They're human beings. They are capital, certainly, but they're also humans. There are humans behind the capital, right? So soft skills doesn't make you soft. It doesn't make the organization, the individual, the team weak.
Yeah. And just building on that is that I always reframe it. I say they're interpersonal skills. And every organization is anchored in relationships. And if you can't leverage and have high proficiency in your interpersonal skills, the relationships will not advance the productivity of the organization. So it's language choice, because there are some, leaders that hear soft skills and then again have their own definition of it. So when you be intentional with the language you use, our communication skills are critical to communicate internally, externally, to vendors, to investors, you name it, right? And so we want to make sure we have those communication skills as proficient internally amongst our teams as we use them externally with those that help to drive the business.
Absolutely. Removing that friction from communication is key in any operational setting. So final question for the two of you all. If troopers or anyone else that listens to the podcast would like to continue this conversation with the two of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you two?
Connect with me on the TroopHR platform. Send me a message. I love to see that I have a personal message in my inbox on the TroopHR platform, and happy to do that. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, my LinkedIn profile. I also check messaging. So one of those are the two best ways to get my attention, and I'd love to follow up.
And Melanie has already offered one way that we all know about, right, which is the platform. But also you can email me at kenya@agreetoagreemediation.com. My website is also agreetoagreemediation.com. So check out some of the work that I do when it comes to workplace conflict, or just email me and we'll connect and talk more about whatever interests you.
Excellent. For the listeners, we'll make sure to put those links there in the description. Melanie, Kenya, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks, Taylor. This was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TroopHR podcast. If you've liked this episode, we would encourage you to like and subscribe. If you would like to learn more about the TroopHR community, you can reach out to troophr.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.